welcome everyone, no matter what time zone you're in around the world, for the September 2024 SHAC seminar. I'm Frank James, I'm chair of SHAC. This is being broadcast live on Zoom and also on YouTube. Basically, the basic format is as ever, sort of a 20 to 30 minute talk, followed by 30 minutes of moderated discussion. If you're on YouTube, please put your questions into the chat box, because I can't access that from here, but they'll be passed to me. People on Zoom will be able to I'll be able to invite you to sort of put your own points personally. So this month's seminar is being given by Joshua Werrett, Josh, who is in his final year as a doctoral student at in classics at the University of Oxford, St John's College, and he tells me he'll be submitting his thesis at the end of October, which is always a pleasant, fingers being crossed. The thesis is an edition of the Visions of Zosimos of Panopolis, with text, translation, and commentary, and his primary research interests is late antique Christian literature written in Greek, especially poetry and alchemical treatises. In October, he will start a job at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he'll be exploring the religious, philosophical, and political elements of the paraphrase of the Gospel of John by Nonus of Panopolis and the Vision of Dorotheus. And for SHAC members particularly, he has been the student representative of SHAC for the past year and a bit, organised a really nice SHAC postgraduate meeting at St John's College in January, and the next one, also organised by him, also at St John's College, will be in January. I'll say more about that at the end. And we've decided to expand the postgraduate sort of pool to sort of the first 3 years of early career researchers, which is not quite the standard definition, but it's a much better definition and for us than other ones. And so he's going to talk today on Imitatio Christi and the aesthetics of martyrdom in the visions of Zosimos of Panopolis. Josh.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Frank. Yeah, thank you and thank you to SHAC for introducing me as well. Thank you as well then for everybody who has tuned in today. Thank you as well to my family, lots of whom have tuned in via YouTube to find out what exactly it is that I do for a living. I guess all I have to say is, yes, this is actually what I do for a living. So in today's talk, we'll be looking into the imitation of Christ and the theme of martyrological suffering throughout Zosimos' visions. Now, the alchemical practice of Zosimos of Panopolis is not just about the transformation of metals. It is about the transformation of the self, of the soul. This double meaning is found throughout Zosimos' works, but is perhaps most noticeable in his visions. In this text, Zosimos uses alchemy as a theurgic practice to understand salvation, a practice which is allegorized as having four major stages: baptism, violent punishment, the separation of body and soul in death, and then rebirth as a spiritual entity. These steps, taken by several characters throughout the text, clearly mimic major points in the life and death of Christ. Today, I want to present the argument that this is not a coincidence. I'll argue that the imitation of Christ and the imitation of early Christian martyrs who are themselves imitating Christ are key motifs in the violent, redemptive, sacrificial aesthetics of Zosimos' text. So we'll look at the main ideas, images, and phrases in the visions, concluding that they all have a great deal of significance with respect to martyrological literature and the idea of Imitatio Christi, the idea of the imitation of Christ. Overall, I hope to demonstrate that those being reborn as spirits throughout Zosimos' text are not being reborn in a vacuum. Rather, Zosimos suggests that in being reborn, They follow in the footsteps of alchemists and Christian martyrs before them in a long imitative line of suffering and transformation, which ultimately starts with Christ. Brilliant. Now, this is a very literary talk on quite a niche text, so I'd like to give a quick summary of the visions first, highlighting parts which are going to come up time and time again. You obviously won't need to remember all of this perfectly, but it'll hopefully serve as a nice kind of orientation throughout the talk. After some brief but obscure musings on nature, and indeed the kind of nature of nature, Zosimos falls asleep and he sees a staircase, an altar in the shape of a chemical alembic, and a sacrificial priest who introduces himself as Ion. Ion then bizarrely describes his own death as a past event. He says that he was dismembered, tortured, decapitated, and burned, but that this transformation taught him how to become a spirit. And this transformative ascent of escaping the body and becoming a spiritual being is a key theme throughout Zosimos' text. In later dream sequences, Zosimos sees people suffering in what he calls classes, places for punishment. He sees people burning in fire and boiling water. Then a homunculus, kind of the small human, which became such a popular alchemical symbol in later periods, tells him that these people are being purified. Zosimos then wakes up, and there's an odd instruction to the reader to build a temple in their mind. This is something that we'll get onto quite a bit later. Poor Zosimos eventually falls asleep again into another dream, where he gets lost, is told to follow one of these homunculi, and eventually sees that homunculus throw himself into the pit of fire from earlier. As I've suggested, the primary idea, the primary theme of Zosimos' visions is the purifying transformation inherent in one's rebirth after death. It may now seem obvious that Imitatio Christi ought to be an idea which is deeply embedded into the fabric of Zosimos' text. In a sense, at least within Zosimos' 4th century milieu, Christ is the ultimate reborn entity, and Zosimos' text gives a technical praxis on how to ascend as he has, how to imitate him. There are other key things linking Christ to Zosimos' alchemical practice. The idea of God as the ultimate alchemist, because of his transformation of humans in the sacrament of baptism, which is also a very important theme in the visions. Maybe as well God as the ultimate alchemist because of the story of Genesis. This is slightly more complicated because of Zosimos' Gnostic leanings, which we won't really go into until later. But it seems to be an obvious idea. And then also the idea of Christ as the philosopher's stone. This is something which Zosimos himself doesn't really talk about, but Carl Jung certainly retrospectively applies to the alchemist's work in the Lapis Christ parallel. Regardless of these, the idea of Christ as the ultimate suffering, dying, reborn, ascending, transformative entity makes him the perfect point of comparison for Zosimos' text, which is itself interested in all of these things. But more than this, there's another vital aspect of Christ's death, which makes the imitation of him so key to the visions. That is his position as a self-sacrificing, sacrificial object. Christ offers himself up as a sacrifice for mankind, but it's a divinely orchestrated event, making Christ both sacrificed and sacrificer. Now, this is certainly something which we see in the visions as well. One of the most well-noted aspects of the text is this kind of odd interplay between people and metals. The homuncular alchemists in the dreams are both dealing with metals and are themselves made of metal. Here too, as with Christ, there's a blurred boundary between sacrificed and sacrificer, between metal and metallurgist. For Zosimos, this is perhaps most clear with the figure of Ion, a man himself made of copper, who is referred to as both the hierugon and the hierugumenos, both the sacrificial priest and the one being sacrificed. And in these terms, we actually have the same verb in both the active and passive voice to emphasize this kind of dual characterization. And this is exactly what the martyrs do too. The idea of sacrifice is somewhat kind of reimagined and transformed in the martyrological texts. They sacrifice themselves, being, at least in a sense, both subject and object of that sacrifice. So I think we can fairly state that the themes of Imitatio Christi and the theme of martyrdom are certainly the right kind of thing that we should be looking for within Zosimos's text. Given that we'll be talking a lot about martyrdom today, it's worth bearing in mind the time at which Zosimos was writing. Now, he's probably, and I say probably because we aren't totally sure when he was writing, but we can be fairly confident that he's writing after the Emperor Galerius's Edict of Toleration in 311, and indeed after Constantine's Edict of Milan 2 years later in 313. In other words, martyrdom by Zosimos, by the time that Zosimos was writing this text, had been made obsolete. The persecution and execution of Christians was no longer a major concern in the Roman world. And it's for this reason that we can start to conclude that Zosimos's elusive interest in martyrdom is fueled by rhetoric rather than ideology. And we'll explore throughout this text just how rhetorically significant these ideas are for Zosimos's text. Martyrs are the ideal vessels for exploring figures who transform into a state of perfection following a period of suffering, just as Zosimos's metals transform into a state of perfected gold after a period of suffering. And that crucially, these processes both start in one way or another with the transformative power of Christ. Good. I want to look now at a few specific images in the visions, which are particularly reminiscent of certain instances in the corpus of martyrological literature. So I've mentioned before this figure Ion, the priest of the inner sanctuaries, who narrates his own death to Zosimos. He says that he was attacked, dismembered, ripped apart along his joints, flayed about his head, crushed up with his bones, and burned. But that this violent experience redeemed him, and he became a pneuma, he became a spirit. In Zosimos's relatively short text, there are no less than 6 scenes of brutal mutilation along these lines, which eventually lead to the purification and spiritual ascent of the one suffering. The modes of punishment throughout the visions include burning and boiling, in punishments reminiscent of alchemical procedures, but also dismemberment, decapitation, flaying, bones being broken, and many others. These are all also types of punishment which appear throughout the acts of the Christian martyrs, with decapitation and dismemberment again taking center stage and being the main punishments across both sets of texts. Take, for instance, the martyrdom of Justin Martyr, in which he expresses a belief that he will go to heaven if he is decapitated. Or St. Ignatius of Antioch's letter to the Romans, in which he states a desire for fire, torn flesh, the dislocation of bones, and the cutting off of his limbs to come upon him so that he might become a spirit. More than just general torture, a decapitation and dismemberment are key images throughout the martyrdom stories, and indeed throughout Zosimos's text. Now, this obviously isn't proof of a connection between the two, but it might well begin to stir ideas of martyrdom for Zosimos's readers. Further along these lines, in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical Histories 4.23, he personifies and describes Christianity, also Christian philosophy, and in particular Christian literature, as a mutilated, suffering body, mirroring the individual who is mutilated, who suffers, and who is martyred for Christ. Indeed, if the Romans knew one thing about Christians, it was that they were happy to suffer for their beliefs and to suffer for their faith. I mentioned burning as another means of punishment and indeed execution, which is common in texts about martyrdom. And indeed, we get people suffering in vats of fire and boiling water throughout the visions. But there is another interesting similarity which I want to draw particular attention to. In Zosimos's text and the martyrdom of Polycarp, we have instances of people being burned alive, but not dying. Just as those being purified in flames in Zosimos, Polycarp is placed on a burning pyre, and the flames encircle him, but he doesn't die. Interesting enough, when he's encircled with fire, Polycarp is said to be hos chrysos kai auguros en camino purumenos, like gold or silver being cooked in an oven. The metallurgical metaphor would perhaps have particularly resonated with the alchemists. Zosimos uses the resonances of the martyrdom of Polycarp to suggest that those burning in the fires, and indeed those being dismembered and decapitated elsewhere, are not just suffering. They're not just being purified for their own sake, but rather they join an imitative line of alchemists and of Christian martyrs who suffer and are transformed in death and rebirth. Beyond these themes and images, there are also terminological similarities between the visions and some common phrases in contemporary Christian literature, which discusses martyrdom as a means of imitating Christ. The three terms which I want to look into today are kolasses, a punishment, the phrase I mentioned earlier, bia apharetos, or apharetos bia, an unbearable force, and the verb akoluthein, to follow. So we'll look at all of these three terms, see how they're used by Zosimos, and then also look into their significance in Christian literature more widely. So, kolasses, punishment. I mentioned earlier that Zosimos is shown several places for punishment throughout his dreams, vats of fire and boiling water being the main two, and that he refers to these as kolasses, places where someone can be punished in a purificatory process leading to their transformation into a spirit. In the New Testament, kolasses is only ever used as a term for the punishment of sinners after death, which is in itself not insignificant given the kind of hellish nature of Zosimos's narrative space. But the term kolasses develops a different nuance over the course of the first few centuries of the Common Era. In the Acts of the Christian Martyrs, when a martyr's struggles, suffering, and death is mentioned, it's spoken about in one of two terms. Either an agon, a struggle or a contest, or, by far the more frequent, a kolasses. Just to give one, what I think is a particularly cool example, in the martyrdom of Pionius, a Turkish Christian who was executed in the second half of the 3rd century, Pionius describes his suffering, and he says, kolasse koladsdomai, I am punished with punishment. So we have a nice use of the term here as a noun, but also transformed into a verb. And he continues in the same sentence to say, katamelos temnomai, I am being torn limb from limb. So we have another instance here of gruesome dismemberment. So kolasses is a term with a lot of martyrological significance. It's a term which not only implies a punishment, but more specifically, the suffering which early Christian martyrs undergo in the process of their death and eventual rebirth in the kingdom of heaven. By using the term kolasses for the places of punishment throughout his text, Zosimos is specifically recalling the suffering, death, and rebirth of the Christian martyrs. Just as the martyrs explicitly died in imitation of Christ's suffering, so are we to understand Zosimos' characters as implicitly dying in this same imitative pattern. Another specific turn of phrase which I want to explore is bia aphoretos, an unbearable force, an unbearable act of violence. As we've seen already, Iron was dismembered, had his head flayed, had his bones crushed, and was burned on a fire until he was reborn as a spirit. And this is what Zosimos, through Iron, refers to as the bia aphoretos. His whole set of suffering is described as this unbearable force. So, where else in contemporary Christian literature do we find this term? Strange enough, the main use of the phrase comes in a very specific context, which leads me to suspect that this actually may be some kind of Christian, idiom is the wrong word, but Christian expression, I suppose. The phrase unbearable force normally appears in reference to a weak grain of sand taking on the unbearable force of the weight of the entire ocean. So Basil of Caesarea, a 4th century bishop and rough contemporary of Zosimos, refers to Christians standing against the full weight of suffering which is imposed upon them as grains of sand standing against the weight of the sea. He never explicitly says what kind of suffering, but one might imagine that the suffering of Christians by martyrdom might be an obvious parallel to draw here. A more explicit use of the phrase in martyrological terms comes to us from another passage from Basil of Caesarea. This time, as he talks about the martyr Gordius, a Turkish Christian soldier who was martyred in about 315. Although friends tried to dissuade Gordius from announcing his faith and thereupon being executed, Basil of Caesarea writes that Gordius's mind was fixed as a house which is unaffected by the unbearable forces of the winds. Similarly, John Chrysostom, who was the Archbishop of Constantinople about a century after Zosimos' time, talks about the martyrs in Egypt set themselves up, karteros, staunchly, and eutonos, powerfully, against the force of the devil, a force which is itself described as chlagdian, violent, and of course, aphoreton, unbearable. A final example, which I think is particularly interesting alongside thinking about divisions, comes to us from Ephrem, a Syrian patriarch writing in the 4th century, so another rough contemporary of Zosimos. This quote here comes in Ephrem's 10th homily, and I mean, just look at the language used in comparison to what we saw earlier when Ion described his own destruction and death. Ephrem writes, "At last bring about the separation of my humble soul from my wretched body, relieving me of this unendurable force." Just as Ion spoke about his soul leaving behind the weight of his body, and just as Zosimos in the introduction to his text states that apospasmos pneumatos aposomatos, the separation of body and soul, would be a key theme, so too here is Ephrem's soul leaving his wretched body. This idea of suffering, releasing the divine soul from its bodily prison is consistent. And again, this suffering is described as an unendurable force. Now, Ephrem isn't talking about martyrdom here, and he himself wasn't martyred. He died of the plague, actually, in the early 370s. But I think it's a worthy parallel because of this language of the soul breaking away from the wretched body. It's consistent across the texts. I've only given 4 examples here, but there are a myriad more which use this phrase in exactly the same way, representing a Christian standing against greater forces of suffering, usually as part of an idiom of grains of sand standing against the sea, and very often as a phrase with significance to martyrology and martyrdom. So, when Ion introduces himself as the priest of the inner sanctuaries, it says that he has suffered an unbearable force, an unbearable violence, in which he's been ripped apart, killed, and reborn as a spiritual being. It's possible that the reader is to understand this as not just any old Christian death and transformative rebirth, but as a martyr's death, as a death in the imitation of Christ, and as the best death possible for a Christian. The final term, which I want to look into, is the verb akoluthein, to follow. I've been talking today about imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, but the idea of imitation, the Greek term being mimesis, actually doesn't appear anywhere in the Synoptic Gospels. Rather, this is something of a reinterpretation of Jesus' message in the light of Plato and Platonic philosophy, which would have been a core element of Paul's Greek education, as he writes this idea of imitation throughout his epistles. Christ actually talks about following him, not imitating him, for which the verb akoluthein is used. It occurs 90 times all in all throughout the Synoptic Gospels, with by far the most common variations being akoluthemoi, an imperative, an instruction from Christ, follow me, and also ekoluthesan auto, they followed him. All this to say, akoluthein isn't a particularly uncommon verb in Greek, but in Christian literature, it takes on a very specific meaning, not even just following Christ, but following in Christ's footsteps and imitating him. So how about in Zosimos' text? The word appears a few times, but this one I think is particularly significant. At the start of one of the later dream sequences, Zosimos falls asleep and gets lost in his dream world. Suddenly, he sees a homunculus wearing royal clothes, who asks, "What are you doing, mortal?" and then says, "Akolutheme, follow me," to the lost Zosimos. Zosimos follows him all the way to the Colossus, the place for punishment, at which point the homunculus jumps in and is devoured by the flames. As you've seen, akoluthein has a lot of baggage to it as following and imitating Christ. Here, in the visions, we have someone wearing royal clothing, using the phrase akolutheme, which occurs frequently in the Synoptic Gospels in the mouth of Christ. This man then throws himself into the place of suffering, the Colossus, the place for martyrdom. He dies, about to be reborn as a spiritual entity, and he instructs Zosimos again to follow him. So I hope you're starting to see that even the language of the vision, the specific terminology, is replete with significance for following Christ as a martyr. Moving away then from precise terminology which indicates imitatio and martyrdom, there's one final scene in the visions to which I would like to draw attention, because the imagery used is so precise that I think it cannot possibly be a coincidence. So this compares a scene in the visions with a scene in the martyrdom of Perpetua. So in a sharp digression from the dream sequences and their cosmic interpretations, which make up the visions, at the end of the first lesson, Zosimos instructs his reader to create a temple in their imagination. And he says that this temple must be built out of a single block of alabaster or white marble. It must have no beginning and no end. It must contain a spring of the purest water. And importantly, there must be a snake lying around the temple, guarding it, and lying with its tail in its mouth. So the iconography of the Ouroboros, this alchemical image of the snake devouring its own tail, is clear. And indeed, the temple is supposed to represent the space in which all things are unified and transformed. It's said to almost be the kind of idealized, divinely inspired place for alchemy. But beyond this alchemical significance, the image also has significance in the act of the Christian martyrs, as they in the martyrdom of Perpetua, which we'll get to in a second. Zosimos' reader, having constructed the temple, is then told to imagine themselves killing and dismembering the snake, repurposing its flesh and bones into the first step of a ladder leading into the temple, and then using that first step to climb into the temple. With this in mind, I'd now like to point to a scene in the martyrdom of Perpetua. While imprisoned, Perpetua falls asleep and sees a ladder made of bronze reaching all the way to the heavens. At the foot of the ladder lay a dragon. Bear in mind that snake and dragon in Latin use the same words, draco. The dragon is said to scare people away from climbing, but Perpetua, assured in her faith, uses the dragon's head as her first step on the ladder, and she climbs into heaven. So we have a metallic ladder leading up to the heavens, and you need to use the head of a draco, a dragon or a snake, as the first step on that ladder. Now, despite Zosimos' story being something of a kind of alchemized version of Perpetua's dream, where the dragon is replaced with an Ouroboros, and you need to manipulate the matter of the creature in some way yourself for it to become a step, despite those things, the images are exactly the same. Perpetua understands her dream as a message that she is going to die, but that she will then be reborn, ascending into heaven as a spirit. Likewise, I would argue that Zosimos' reader is reminded of this when reading the passage about the imaginary temple. In entering the temple, you aren't just entering the place for alchemy. You're following in the footsteps of people who have suffered and been reborn in a grand line of imitation, which includes alchemists and Christian martyrs, going back through Zosimos, through Ion, through Perpetua, through Paul, but which ultimately starts with Christ. Okay. Good timing. Before wrapping up, I'd like to play off of a relatively recently published article and explore how what's being discussed today might influence the conclusions drawn there. So I'm referring to Olivier Dufault's paper published in Aries 2 years ago, Was Zosimos of Panopolis Christian? And I'm grateful to Jenny Rampling and Mark Edwards, both of whom I spoke to on this subject at the last SHAC postgrad seminar in January. Now, Zosimos' religious views are famously complicated because of his attempts to synthesize various late antique religio-philosophical trends together. Zosimos will just as happily talk about Christ as he will Osiris, as he will Adam, as he will Thoth, as he will the demiurge. He'll also just as happily treat Hermes as an authority as he will Moses, as he will Plato. And you get the picture. Zosimos' personal religious convictions are, on the surface, a syncretistic mess. But what's fascinating is his own belief that he's been able to successfully blend them into a coherent religious and philosophical worldview. And this is the reason why there is some doubt over to what extent he can really be called a Christian. The idea being, what kind of Christian would be talking about Osiris and Thoth in these ways? And the answer, when you look into it, is actually quite a lot of them. And indeed, it is quite easy to get lost in complicated theories of identity politics and religious syncretism in late antique Egypt. But I think we can safely say that Zosimos is a Christian. And this is indeed what Dufault concludes. Zosimos fundamentally believes in the soteriological power of Christ. And at a time when Christianity was so ill-defined and different Christianities abounded, that fundamental belief really does go a long way. Dufault points largely to another of Zosimos' treatises on the letter Omega, in which he explicitly refers to Christ as the one who leads Adam back to paradise. And Adam here doesn't refer specifically to Adam, of Adam and Eve fame, but rather to mankind more generally. Adam actually essentially refers to flesh in general in Zosimos' Gnostic etiology of mankind. So Christ leads people from their flesh and into paradise. But I think we can use the ideas discussed today to go further with this idea. Zosimos is really interested in this Christ-led, but also Christ-started transformation from flesh into soul, which ends up in ascent to heaven. And he explores this through the aesthetics of distinctly Christian martyrdom. I think we can ultimately be in no doubt that Zosimos was indeed a Christian, and the narrative elements we've explored today really drive home this idea. The point I hoped to get across in this talk is that martyrs are the vessels of the imitation of Christ. And throughout the visions, Zosimos uses identical themes, images, and phrases to suggest that his characters are not just alchemically reborn, but are reborn into this same imitative line we've been talking about. And that such a death is a transformative and perfecting experience, being reborn in gold, but also being reborn in Christ. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. That was really interesting. See if I can find my clapping icon. Thank you. Could you remove your slides, please, so I can see everybody?
Oh yes, sorry, I'll do that.
Screen. Right. I'll exercise my chair's prerogative and ask the first question. Not that I know anything at all about your topic, but a lot of the things you say sort of kept on reminding me forcibly of William Blake and his sort of poetry and imagery in his various pieces of work. And I wonder whether that's not a coincidence, because Blake was heavily into the millennialism work that was around in the sort of late 18th, early 19th century under the sort of pressure of global conflict. So do you think Blake might have come across Zosimos, or is that just pushing it a bit?
I don't know the first thing about William Blake, if I'm totally honest. I would, however, say that a lot of the images that you see repeat themselves throughout later alchemical work. I mean, the stuff that I've looked into is particularly kind of medieval and Renaissance stuff. But the ideas which you see repeat themselves often start with Zosimos. I mean, the idea of the homunculus, I think, well, from the research I've done, I think it's safe to start with Zosimos. And yeah, there are lots of ideas kind of spreading from his text, which develop outwards. And I mean, yeah, the idea of suffering and transformation, going back to Christ, I think is a fairly obvious parallel to draw in alchemical literature. So I've drawn specifically with Zosimos here, but I think, yeah, it's very safe to say that it could have come up. It will have come up a lot later with lots of alchemists going forward.
Okay, thank you. Jenny, you're muted.
Thanks, Frank. Thank you, Joshua. Fantastic talk as always. So I found a lot of your analysis of language very persuasive. The terms that you've found in the martyrological literature that recur in Zosimos, I mean, that seems to me great evidence. I guess the one example which I find less persuasive, or certainly less persuasive than you do, is the serpent. So I want to press you a bit more on that. My reason for pushing on that is that I do think that although both Perpetua and Zosimos invoke the idea of the serpent or draconic body in relation to climbing up either steps to a temple or a ladder. I actually think they're not the same thing, but anyway. There were other elements in their usage which seem very different. So I think climbing the steps to a temple has a slightly different, and specifically rending the body of a serpent in advance, has slightly different connotations to stepping on the humbled head of the serpent in the name of Christ to ascend to heaven, as Perpetua said. And one of my reasons for pressing on this is that there's plenty of evidence from Greek and Roman mythology that could do exactly the same work. And I'm thinking especially of Cadmus, for example, destroying the serpent and actually essentially using its remains to build the cadmium, to build a city. And I think you could use that just as persuasively as the martyrological case. So, and I suppose there's Apollo and the Pythia as well. It just seems to me there's another tradition here. And I wonder what happens if you introduce that tradition. Does it perhaps introduce any conflicts that make your set of comparisons slightly more complicated? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, the first point to make, I guess, is when you spoke about, or when you asked about the ladder and the staircase as being slightly different things, in the same way that we can say that dragon and snake are fundamentally the same kind of thing because of the word Draco. In Greek, the ladder and the staircase both use the word klimax. So I've translated it as staircase or ladder, whatever, but fundamentally it's the same kind of idea of upwards motion. Yeah, I think there is definitely something to be said about other traditions coming into Zosimus's work, mainly because, as I mentioned at the end, Zosimus's work takes so many different traditions and brings them all together. I think classical texts in particular, you don't really find in Zosimus that much. So he's writing from Panopolis, not probably writing from Panopolis, which, although it was in Christianized Egypt, remained a very, very pagan city kind of right through to the end. But even though we're talking about paganism, we're talking mainly here, I think, about Egyptian paganism as opposed to Greek paganism and these Egyptian stories rather than Greek stories. Now, Cadmus obviously is in the kind of Thebaid, and he's in Egypt himself anyway. But I think the tale it abounds more in the Greek world than it does in the Egyptian world. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying it's very possible that there is another link there, because, like I said, there's so much going on in Zosimus. I think if that were the case, it doesn't necessarily detract from the ultimate conclusion that Zosimus is trying to bring all of these parallels to, martyrdom in general. But no, yeah, I think it's interesting that there are. I mean, it's interesting in general, I guess, that the same kinds of stories, the same kinds of ideas come up in so many different traditions.
Okay, thank you. So Fabrina Lopez de Silveira.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Josh. We spoke a long time ago, right, when you were beginning, right? So it's really nice to see how you. Yes, nice to meet you. To see how your research is going, I thought that all those parallels you found with these martyrdom sources in relation to the intolerable act of violence, extremely compelling and persuasive. So that was all very exciting. And but my question is more general, and I thought that maybe I could connect it with Jennifer Rampling's comment about this sort of other more properly or classical Greek tradition, because I thought that all your parallels, as I said, were very compelling. There's also all other things in Zosimus' visions, right? The way he describes the dream in the beginning is very reminiscent of Jacob's dream of the ladder as well. So he's always using these sort of references, but at the same time, his use of them is very tacit, isn't it? So I guess I was wondering, what you make out of the conspicuous absence of Jesus Christ. In the vision specifically, he doesn't mention his name actually, does he? He does it on the letter omega. And I ask this and I connect this with Rampling's comment because for a long time I thought that Ion, you know, his name had something to do possibly with Ion, the priest of Apollo's temple in Euripides. And Gregory at the time suggested that I tone that down. But the place full of serpents, you know, there's all this Cadmean mythology that could be at play. But again, Zosimos does not make that connection explicit, right? Which makes our job hard, basically. So I just thought, yes, what do you make out of the fact that these connections are not made as explicit in the visions as they are on the letter omega, basically?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's got a lot.
Sorry to interrupt you. There's one thing I was going to say and I forgot. Sorry. Yeah. And in terms of Euripides, one of the things that, you know, I thought about at the time that could be, you know, we do find fragments of Euripides in the Oxyrhynchus papyri, right? So, you know, although obviously Zosimos was drawing so much of this eclectic Egyptian paganism, you know, there is some evidence that Euripides texts were circulating at the time. There's no fragment of Ion in the Oxyrhynchus papyri, but still. Anyway, yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think it has a lot to do with, to go back to the first part of the question. You know, why things so kind of implicit and tacit within visions? I think it's got a lot to do actually with the kind of, I guess you call them kind of poetics of the visions, in the sense that it's a text which is supposed to be quite difficult to uncover, and you're supposed to go searching for meaning, searching for allusions, and searching for all these things, which makes it unique. I was about to say unique. Unique is a very dangerous word to use in scholarship, but it makes it very, very different from a lot of other of Zosimos' texts. You mentioned the on the letter Omega earlier, and obviously in on the letter Omega, it's very, very clear. Kind of these are my thoughts, and you know. He talks very explicitly about Christ as the soteriological figure, particularly with respect to Adam. I think the visions fundamentally is just trying to do something a bit different. I think it's not trying to be as explicit. I mean, there's a huge question, as you will well know. There's a huge question about, you know, what actually is the visions. Is it a letter to Theurgic? Is it just a general treatise for kind of wider circulation? I guess the difficulty of interpreting the visions and all of these, the fact that everything is implicit, everything's, you know, kind of under the surface, and you really need to go looking for different allusions. I think it lends itself to the idea that maybe this isn't a letter, or at least if it is a letter, it's less to somebody with very specific knowledge, the kind of, you know, the ability to decode alchemical allegory, which we've lost by this stage, so it makes it quite difficult in general. But yeah, I think the absence of explicit, really, really explicit allusion in Zosimos visions is just really generally just part of the text, and you know, it's supposed to be this kind of thing that you're supposed to struggle with and grapple with, and you know, try to find. I guess there is then the other side. The answer I've just given assumes that it's a piece of fiction, it's a piece of kind of constructed literature. I guess the other answer is, if they are real dreams which he really had, then yeah, the answer is obvious. It's because Jesus didn't happen to not come up in his dream, so he doesn't pop in the text. When you bring up Ion, I think it's interesting. I mean, there are very few names which appear throughout the text. So when names do appear, they are particularly interesting. So Ion is the name which comes up as the most obvious. Agathodaimon as well comes up later, and that's obviously also a very kind of almost just the opposite. That's almost very kind of on the nose, with how alchemically significant it is as a name, but explicit both to alchemy and to kind of the city of Alexandria and Roman Egypt in general. But yeah, I think the reason why we don't find Christ as an explicit figure in in the visions is because that's not what the visions is trying to do. It's different from final count. It's different from on letter omega. It's trying to do something different.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions or comments? Anything on YouTube?
I'd like to ask if there's anything on YouTube.
Okay. Becky and Anna, can you just check if there's anything on YouTube, and Jenny can have a second question. Jenny.
Sorry about that problem with it. Okay, I'm connected now. Yes, sorry, I didn't want to kind of hog the question time, but I did want to ask you, Josh, and this is a large question, so you can answer it however you wish, really. What can we infer about the reading practices of Zosimos of Panopolis?
What do you mean by the reading practices, as in his?
Well, given that he doesn't tell us what he's read,
his stuff, yeah.
Heard. You have, you and other scholars have been doing this wonderful, intricate work in trying to piece together what the influence is. Can you speculate at all as to the kind of reading material, the kind of material through which he might have accessed these influences? Like I say, it's a big question and a broad question, and you'd be quite within your rights to say, I have no idea. But I just wondered, given this close work you've been doing, if you wanted
I have no idea / lots. Yeah, so it's an interesting idea. I think the best way, there are two ways to answer it, really. And it's to look at his texts and his texts themselves, almost as though they're in a vacuum, and what are the things that we find within his texts, which he references elsewhere. And we find a lot of explicit references to the Hermetic literature. So in his final account, he talks about running down to Poimenandra, which is an explicit reference to the Poimandres in Corpus Hermeticum 1. There aren't really many other explicit references like that. You have to pay more attention to, I think, the implicit references, like things that we've discussed today. The other way of answering the question, I guess, is to also look at where he was writing and the kinds of texts that we find there, and also the kind of texts that the people he would have been working close to, what have they read? And you can kind of see that maybe he read similar things.
That's exactly where I was going with that. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. So he was writing in either Panopolis or Alexandria. The chances are kind of he's from Panopolis, but worked in Alexandria for a long time and then came back. Which is great because we can be so specific. We can narrow it down to 2 different cities. The difficulty is that they're 2 cities with absolutely enormous literary inputs and outputs. They're big kind of copyist cities where a lot of literature is coming in and out, which takes the question again from being very specific and quite easy to making it massive and, again, very, very difficult. From the stuff that we found in the area, there's an awful lot of, in Panopolis specifically, I think, there's an awful lot of Gnostic literature, which has been found there, an awful lot of Hermetic literature, which has been found there. As Fabian said earlier, in Oxyrhynchus, not too far from Panopolis, there's a lot of Greek classical literature, which was found there. There's some Pindar, I think, quite a lot of Pindar. So there's a huge kind of array of different things which you probably read at some point and could be engaging with. In my experience with Zosimos, I think particularly in the visions, I like the argument that he's engaging much more with Judeo-Christian and Egyptian literature than he is with Greco-Roman literature. And I suppose the only evidence I have for that is that kind of that feeling you get from reading the text, and this just kind of feels like this feels like the kind of thing which is coming up again and again and again. So yeah, it's difficult to say exactly what he wrote because there are so few explicit references to other bits of literature in his text. If the visions came with a bibliography at the end, then my thesis would be significantly easier to write than it has been over the last couple of years. But yeah, I think if we look to where he was writing, then I think a lot of Hermetic literature, a lot of Gnostic literature, lots of things like the Septuagint as well. Yeah, we can be fairly certain that all of these would have crossed his desk at some point.
Fantastic, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have one question from YouTube, and it's from Dean McGrath, who asks, is it possible that IOS figure of copper is a reference to copperas, and Zosimos is discussing a process of roasting copperas to produce sulfuric acid, which when married with ethanol will produce diethyl ether?
Okay, this is a very technical chemistry question. IOS figure of copper is, I'm not entirely sure what that means. Does that mean ioned, the figure of copper made from copper in the
I'm not
first
sure.
place? I'll assume yes, because that'll make the question slightly easier. And well, iron is the figure of copper anyway, so presumably this is vaguely what this is trying to get at. Iron's name is, again, something which Fabiana brought up earlier, is really, really quite difficult to work out exactly what's going on there, because it could mean so many different things. So as Fabiana brought up, there is a figure called Ion, who's a temple priest in Euripidean work, in Euripidean tragedy. Ion could also mean, and the Greek term ion can also mean an alchemical color change. It can also mean like the venom of a snake. It can also, I think, Festugier refers to it as ion, the idea of eternity and kind of in sense of a kind of an ultimate god. So there are lots of different things which you could be kind of mess around with when it comes to an ion. I would tend to suggest, I think, that it's more than anything to do with the EOS, the kind of the bit that you get when you do the alchemical process of eosis, or rubedo in the later Latin, in the later Latin parlance of alchemy. So I think it's to do with, yeah, it's to do with this kind of color change more than anything else. To answer the question specifically, if there is a color change when you do those processes, then I guess I would suggest that the answer is yes. But I'm afraid I'm not entirely sure what happens when you roast copperas with sulfuric acids and different things.
So have you thought about going down the path that Jenny Rampling and Larry Principi have gone down, of trying to recreate some of these experiments? Is not quite the right word, some of these sort of chemical reactions, to see if you could understand what was actually happening, if that was possible. It may not be possible.
This is a really, really good question. And when I first started my doctoral work, that was the route I wanted to go down. I thought, I would quite easily be able to decipher an alchemical recipe out of this, and then I would go to a lab and see what happened, as follow the footsteps of Jenny and Larry Principi. But it's been quite difficult to actually draw a recipe out of Zosimos' text, and to an extent, I think that's purposeful. I'm starting to get to the stage where I don't actually think the Visions has an alchemical recipe. Kind of, it's not an allegorised alchemical recipe. I don't think there's an alchemical recipe kind of encoded into it. I think rather it's a text which exposes and highlights different bits of the alchemical process and draws specific attention to them. So in particular, that there is a new method of doing alchemy, which came from Maria the Jewess, and which Zosimos really picked up, which is called the Keratakis method. And I think in particular, the Visions is a kind of celebration, a kind of like a highlighting of that method as being particularly important and also effective. So yeah, I think it's quite difficult to draw a recipe out of Zosimos' Visions in particular. There are lots of other more explicit recipes that he gives in other bits of his corpus. But yeah, I don't think there is one in the visions specifically.
Okay. Jenny has a comment.
Yes, yeah. So one of the key ingredients, I guess, is not quite the right shade of phrase, but you know the thing I mean, which is Zosimos mentions, is this thing divine water, theon hudor, which could equally mean divine water and sulfuric water. It's exactly the same term in Greek. So it's this kind of pun of the constitution of the water, but also the kind of force and power of the water. And yeah, there have been lots of different ways of trying to make this divine water. And Zosimos actually gives about 10 or 11 different recipes for the water throughout his entire kind of more technical side of his corpus. And yeah, they from the outside looking in seem to have been very, very successful. And yeah, I mean, in general, I think Matteo Martelli's work with the Alchemist project has been very successful in general, and it's something I'd recommend everybody go and take a long look at.
Okay, we've got time for one more question or comment before we wrap up. Fabiana.
Hi, thank you. I don't mean to monopolize, but as there's been no other raised hands, I thought I'd jump in. So this is more of a philological question, Josh, and it's something that I've been thinking about and don't have a final answer to this moment. But when it comes to the ensemble of the visions, right? Memoirs 10, 11, 12. When it comes to 11 and 12, and you mentioned this, there's quite a lot of repetition, right? Sort of entire phrases that repeat themselves. And to this day, I ask myself whether we are talking about an actual sequence, and these images are repeated purposefully. Jung changes the order completely, right? He says, this is not the right order. Let me put them all back to where they were supposed to be. Or I ask myself, are we dealing with epitomes of Zosimos? And, this could be, a distillation of the longer visions and so on. So I was wondering how you're thinking about these questions, because I think you're doing an edition as well. So, right. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And it's interesting looking at the manuscript tradition as well, kind of where when you get different parts of the first set of the first kind of, lesson 10 of the visions, you have, I think, 3 different versions of that, but the final 2 bits, 12 and 13, there are only 2. Oh no, one even, I think. And yeah, obviously it's they're so different in the way that they've been written, that I think you have to either imagine they've been written by somebody else trying to claim a kind of sequel to Zosimos, the first set of Zosimos visions, for themselves, or like say if they've been kind of bastardized and shortened down and kind of summarized, which actually happens quite a lot in alchemical literature. We have these sort of shortened down to just the key bullet points. It's a very, very different style of writing. You go from these kind of huge digressions on the cosmic interpretation of different things, and there's a lot of kind of allegory and sayings and all of these different things, to it's the last 2 units are very kind of staccato almost. It's this happens, then this happens, this happens. I think it's a really difficult question, and I suppose my answer would probably be, I think using philology is quite difficult, because it could equally be that a lot of the language is very similar for 10 to 11 and 12. So I think you could simultaneously say that Zosimos is still using this kind of language, and therefore it's probably still written by him, or as if it was written by somebody else, they would use probably the same turns of phrase and just kind of leave bigger chunks out. I would suggest probably the latter, that Zosimos did write an 11 and 12, but they've only come down to us in a kind of shortened form. That makes it quite difficult though, because then when we find it in the actual kind of Byzantine manuscript, it's given all as one kind of continuous text, which makes it very difficult to then think, well, why would they write up the first one in full and the second two in summary, unless it got to them in that way, and you have kind of Byzantine copying traditions, and I think it's more complicated and unknown once you go beyond that. But yeah, I would probably suggest that 11 and 12 are summaries of what used to be an original.
It's a tough one.
Okay,
Thank
and
you.
on that, I think I will sort of bring the seminar to a close. The next seminar in this series will be on the 21st of November, when Matthew Eddy will be talking. In the meantime, the SHAC autumn meeting will be held on the 11th of October in Amsterdam. I have been promised, without fail, that the registration link will be ready on Monday. I'm still biting my fingernails in anticipation of that. And finally, Josh is running the next SHAC postgraduate early career meeting on the 14th of January in St. John's College, Oxford. So it just remains for me to thank all the people who've been involved one way or another in running this meeting. A surprising number of people are involved in getting these seminars to screen. So Anna Simmons, Rob Johnson, Caroline Cobbold, Becky Martin, Chris Campbell, and Joe Hedison. But of course, it wouldn't have been possible at all without our speaker, Josh. So thank you so much, Josh, for giving a really interesting talk. And
Thank you very much.
Clapping. There we are. Okay, so have